I imagine you all have more or less had the childhood fantasy of picture if there was like a computer where you could just type in a general vague request and it would simulate or produce a very well defined product or simulation or just something based on the vague request that you put in. For example, if you don't quite understand what I mean, um, let's say you wanted to watch like a made up movie, like, let's say like Star Wars was your favorite cinematic franchise, and you were like, oh, what if there was a new Star Wars movie that hadn't come out yet, or like one that had never come out? Let's say like one based on like the old republic or something like that. I don't really know a whole lot about Star Wars. So like maybe in your childhood imagination you'd be like, what if I could just type that into a computer, make me a Star Wars movie based on the old republic, and that's all you had to type, and then all of a sudden the computer would just produce an entire movie that would not only be based on the portion of the franchise that you requested, but would be a movie to your liking. It would be something that would satisfy you. It's not like you would watch the movie that the computer produced and be like, oh, that was kind of a sucky movie. The computer didn't produce something that really catered to me, right? Like, you wouldn't have to give the computer feedback about what it produced or what it simulated. It would just perfectly hit the spot, all based on one sentence. You don't have to go in and type out a whole story. You don't have to be like a screenwriter. You don't have to do any of that. You don't have to like sit there and write a novel. Just based on one sentence, somehow, with that simple, vague request alone, not only could the computer produce an entire movie involving that request, but it could do it to a degree that is to your liking 100% without any complaints from you. Okay, well, my condition has a feature like that. So if reality is reflective of it, you could picture reality having this sort of feature where it can take vague, general, sort of well-defined requests, or even, I shouldn't say well-defined. I misspoke there. I meant ill-defined requests. So the requests can be general and vague. They don't have to be well-defined. They can be completely ill-defined or even entirely undefined. You don't really have to put any effort into the request, and yet the product will be there. Not just in an ill-defined or undefined manner, but in a well-defined manner. So despite the fact that the prompt for the product is ill-defined or even entirely undefined, the product itself will still come out entirely well defined to your liking. It'll be perfectly satisfying to the prompt that you put in 100%. So now picture if reality were this way. So, I talk a lot about triviality on this channel. I've also talked about other stuff that's like maximal or metamaximal, right? Like all encompassing or beyond all encompassing. It includes anything and everything, or more than anything and everything, right? So metamaximal stuff like that. You could also picture like stories or fictions that are maximal or metamaximal, like the movie Everything Everywhere All at Once that a couple of you have told me about, or Jujutsu Kaisen. I believe that's how you pronounce it correctly. I don't really watch anime, but these are just some fictions that people have brought up to me who are like interested in my channel, or Sugsverse, like things like that. So all these like maximal or metamaximal fictions or completely made up concepts which are maximal or metamaximal, and I call them concepts not because they're just concepts, right? Obviously, if they're maximal or metamaximal or further than that, they're not just going to be concepts. But for lack of better terms, you have all these concepts which can be made up, and yet now picture if you were to jump into those domains themselves. Like if you were to jump in to a maximal or metamaximal domain, even an entirely made up one, like all these fictional concepts, if you were to jump into the actual concrete domain itself, picture what could be made up in there. Like what sort of fiction would be able to be produced in those domains. So we here, us, we're sitting here as human beings, we're able to think up those concepts as fictions, right? Maximals and metamaximals and all that stuff. But now picture if you jumped into the actual domain, those domains are more powerful than what we have here. I mean, we conceptualize them to be as such. We fictionalize them to be more powerful than anything we have here. So now picture if you were actually able to jump in to the real concrete domain, given that expanded or extended amount of power or resources that would be available there. Now imagine the types of fiction that they could produce with those extended resources. And so this is where it ties back to how I started this video, the concept of a computer that could take an ill-defined or even entirely undefined prompt and produce a well-defined product based off that prompt. So notice I'm talking about prompts here, which we can't actually produce, right? I'm talking about like these hypotheticals. Picture if you were able to jump into some maximal or metamaximal fictional domain and be able to have access to the types of fictions that they're able to produce, right? So it's a very ill-defined hypothetical that I'm going over here. It's a very undefined prompt. But by definition, if you were to be able to hop into those domains, you would find the well-defined products of these prompts there. That's just how those domains would be by definition. You would find them there. They wouldn't be ill-defined or undefined as they are here with me speaking about them. They would be sharp and fleshed out and stark and entirely well-defined to your satisfaction. They would be metamaximally produced fictions, literally, to the fullest extent. So now let's take that further. So we hop into those domains, look at the types of fictional concepts they're able to produce. Okay, now let's hop into their fictional domains, like the actual domains that they merely conceptualize as fictional concepts. Okay, so to them, kind of like how they are to us, those further domains are going to be ill-defined or completely undefined, and yet once we hop into the actual domains themselves, now it's going to be a well-defined product. So we keep coming up with these hypothetical prompts and then hopping into the actual domains and getting the actual product that satisfies the prompt. We keep doing this over and over and over again, just boundlessly, forever. So notice that this has a very ad hoc quality to it, in that if, let's say, we were to have a conversation about triviality and say, oh, well, it's all inclusive, it includes anything and everything, and you say, oh, well, Ethan, even if it's all encompassing, it's still something which we're able to conceptualize in a way, at least vaguely. Maybe not fully, but we can at least conceptualize it in the sense that we can have a conversation about it like we are here. Okay, so now picture something which we could not talk about, something which we could not conceptualize, right? Something which somehow breaks objectively past triviality to such an extent that we can't even have a conversation about it. Okay, so now, see, we're coming up with a sort of undefined prompt which has yet to be satisfied. So now picture if we were able to hop into a domain where it was satisfied. Okay, now we would have a concept which somehow breaks past triviality. Not just triviality, it could break past the other fictional concepts, other maximal or metamaximal stuff, so on and so forth. And so what we're sort of doing here is world hopping, right? So we look at all the concepts we can produce in this world, looking at all the prompts we can come up with as hypotheticals, and then imagining ourselves as hopping into the worlds where those concepts are real, they're tangible, they're actual, they're not just hypothetical prompts, right? It's like the computer satisfying your made-up Star Wars movie, giving the full product to you. But then once we're in those worlds, now we look at the types of fictions they're able to produce, and then we hop into those further domains. And we look at what they're able to produce as prompts, and then hop into the actual products themselves, and then look at what those products are able to produce as prompts, and then hop into those products, so on and so forth, forever and ever and ever. So we can just keep going with it. And so this is how it becomes ad hoc, right? So again, remember, ad hoc is sort of like a modification of a feature, right? So like if you have an ad hoc argument, it basically means that you start off with your argument being in one structure, and then as soon as somebody poses an objection to it, you modify or reshape the structure of your argument to try and make it immune to that objection, right? It's a fallacy, but it's fair game here with this topic. Even though ad hoc is a fallacious feature, we need to use it in order to actually discuss the nature of what it means for something to be absolutely boundless. Because if it's absolutely boundless, it is going to have this sort of world hopping feature where we can keep producing these prompts, going into the products themselves, getting more prompts, and keep hopping further and further and further, where, see, we're always going to be able to keep going and getting newer and newer and newer stuff. It's always going to be fresh, right? We can always have entirely brand new things put forth. So we're going to be able to keep modifying and stretching what we have in our storage or our storehouse of available concepts. So when we talk about absolute boundlessness or absolute endlessness or absolute infinity, we start off with that as like the structure of our concept. Like, okay, it's absolutely boundless, it includes anything and everything, it's trivial, it's maximal, it's all inclusive, etc. But then we think, okay, well, what if we now hopped into a world where we could produce even more powerful concepts than that? And so now we stretch further to accommodate those further concepts. And then whatever prompts those can come up with, we stretch it further. So we're modifying, right? We're adding on to the original structure that we started with. That's why it's sort of like an ad hoc fallacy. We keep stretching it. We keep trying to modify what we originally started with. But see, here's the thing. This modification is merely an analogy. Because if reality is absolutely boundless, it's not going to need to modify itself in order to accommodate these further prompts and further products and further structures. It's already going to be of such a nature, even before the prompts are produced, right? Even before the new prompts are produced, they're already going to exist, and they're already going to be accommodated. They're already going to be included. So it's not just ad hoc, right? It's more than that. It's like it's so ad hoc that we don't even need the ad hoc, right? We can modify it to such a great extent that we never needed to modify it in the first place, and so we never needed to be ad hoc. Again, this is why I call my condition, or like the nature of reality, that's why I describe it as a sort of frozen explosion, in that it keeps going and going and going. It can keep expanding and exploding outwards, and yet it doesn't actually have to move. It doesn't actually have to perform that expansion or that explosion outwards. It's already like that. It's already out there. It's already exploded. So it's a frozen explosion, right? It's a moving stillness. It keeps going and going and going, such that it can keep getting more expansive, more metamaximal, more accommodating, and yet it doesn't actually have to reshape itself in order to do that. It doesn't actually have to modify itself. So it doesn't have to be ad hoc in a literal sense. It's ad hoc in a conversational sense, right? As we talk about it, it appears to be ad hoc because we keep saying, okay, well, it's not just trivial. It's also that further stuff with those further prompts, and then it's the products of those further prompts, so on and so forth. So it looks like we're modifying it, and it looks like we're utilizing a sort of ad hoc fallacy as we speak about the nature of it, but that's merely an analogy. It's not actually ad hoc per se, because it's already like that. We keep climbing forward and clarifying it or elucidating it more and more and more. So it's very mystical and very mystifying in the sense that, there's always more to go, so there's always more mystery, and yet we can keep elucidating it, and it's just like as we elucidate it, it appears to modify, it appears to be ad hoc, but it's actually even more bizarre than that because it doesn't need to reshape itself. It's so ad hoc that it is already at those further points. And so this is something I'm going to discuss in a later part of this video, is what exactly that feels like. What does it feel like for a condition to be ad hoc in this way, where it can keep being modified or expanded or upgraded, like literally upgraded and reshaped without actually having to upgrade or reshape it. But I'll leave you with sort of a simple explanation, which will maybe help you, I guess, somewhat imagine what it's like, but then I'll detail it further in the next video. Is, picture if you had a psychedelic trip and you experienced boundlessness or experienced infinity. A lot of psychonauts will describe having trips like that. And then later on, they'll take the psychedelic again, and they'll have a trip that's even more infinite or even more boundless, right? And then they go back, they take another dosage, and then it's even more total, it's even more expansive, and it keeps just getting more and more and more and more infinite. So picture if you just put on a calendar all the trips you've ever taken. Now, I don't do psychedelics, but just if you were to take them, picture if you were to mark them off on a calendar. Okay, so you take a psychedelic this month, January 2024, you have a boundless trip, and then you come back 3 months later, April 2024, have another trip, and just picture all the future trips you're going to have. Let's just say you do them for years and years and years. If they were to keep getting more expansive and more boundless, picture how expansive one of your trips would be in the year 2050, right? So that's something that's going to happen to you in the future, but you haven't experienced it yet, obviously, because it's something to come in the future. Okay, now picture if that future trip were already experienced. Now, yeah, people who do psychedelics and trip out, they'll describe these sorts of non-linear experiences of time, but that's within the trip, right? They'll be okay, when I was tripping out, past, present, and future, all that, that whole distinction of time blurred away. But it's still its own trip, right? Here in your everyday human life, within this context, that trip still happened at a specific point in time. It was still chronological. It still happened in January of 2024. So within the experience of the trip itself, yeah, it's non-chronological. It's timeless. Past, present, and future are all blurred, and those distinctions disappear. But within the context of your everyday personal life, it is still chronological. It still happened at a specific point in January 2024. So it is still placed somewhere in time. I'm talking about now, picture if even in your everyday personal life, things were non-linear, such that the trip which happens at a specific point in the year 2050 has already happened. So it's not just that within the psychedelic trip time gets blurred, it's that even all the future trips which are located at a specific point in time relative to your everyday life, even those have all their distinctions blurred, such that even though they have yet to happen and even though they're going to happen in the future, they've actually just already happened. All the further, more expansive trips, they've already happened. Except now, picture this going on for eternity. Picture if you were to somehow, live forever, right? And be able to just keep doing psychedelics for eternity and having more and more expansive trips, right? That happen again at specific points in time relative to your everyday life. So, okay, one of the trips that happens in 2050, it's going to be way more expansive than the one you just had here in January of 2024. Okay, but now picture one that you have 50 years later in the year 2100, or picture how expansive a trip in the year 2300 would be. Again, assuming that they keep getting more expansive. Or the year 3000, right? What would a trip look like in the year 3000? If they just keep growing for eternity, what would these future trips look like? How inclusive would they get? Yeah, now picture breaking past that entire eternity. An eternity full of all these pinpoints on your calendar in which you have a more expansive psychedelic experience. You break past that entire eternity, and now there's a new set of all these trips, all these points in time on this new calendar in this new eternity, and then you break past that, and you keep breaking past all eternities. Let's say you then even break past what any of those psychedelic trips can capture. Such that no matter how powerful the psychedelic is, and no matter how expansive the psychedelic trip is, they're never going to catch up to those later things. And yet now picture if you had those later, more inclusive things already here. And that is how crazy this ad hoc feature gets. This is where I'm probably going to get a lot of people understandably skeptical of the whole feature, because it is a very outrageous claim. You know, it is very nonsensical. But I will discuss that in further detail in the next video. Let me know if you have any questions on anything I've discussed in this one. If not, I'll see you all next time. Create a nice day.